So let's continue chapter 1 with the levels of organization. There are 6 levels of structural organization, and from smallest to largest, these levels are the chemical level at the smallest level, the cellular level, the tissue level, the organ system level, and finally the largest level of structural organization is the organismal level. So let's begin at the chemical level. So the chemical level, as we mentioned previously, is the simplest level of structural organization. And within the chemical level, we have elements and molecules. Now, elements are things like you see here, these 4 that you see here: nitrogen, oxygen, carbon, and hydrogen. And these elements are arranged in different ways to form molecules. Now, molecules are things like water, which is 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen. Alanine is an amino acid, so it's the building block of, or one of the building blocks that form proteins. And glucose is a carbohydrate or a sugar. That's the primary fuel for our body. So these are the molecules that we're talking about here. Now, chemistry gives us the periodic table of the elements, and these are all of the elements that can combine to form molecules, or at least all of the elements that we know that exist in the world and in the universe that can combine to form molecules. Many of these elements, however, are not found within our bodies, and so we focus on really kind of a few specific elements that make up the bulk of the elements that form our molecules. So the 4 that I highlighted previously, nitrogen, oxygen, carbon, and hydrogen, together, I kind of like to think of those as kind of the big 4 elements within our body, because together those compose roughly 96 or so % of our body weight. So those 4 elements right there compose kind of the vast majority of our body weight. So they are in high abundance, they are very important to us, but they're not the only important elements. So we do have other elements that are within our body that are not in as high quantities, but their importance is just as high. That is, they're just as critical to our survival as nitrogen, oxygen, carbon, and hydrogen are. And these elements, really in no particular order here, are things like sodium, potassium, calcium, phosphorus, and iron. So let's take a look at what each of these does individually. So sodium is important in maintaining fluid balance within our cells and within our tissues. And it's also an important component of electrical signals generated by nerve cells and muscle cells as well. Potassium is critical for proper nervous and muscle function in kind of the same way that sodium is. It helps conduct nerve impulses and is a big player in muscle contraction as well, particularly with cardiac muscle. So we see that in particular cardiac muscle is very dependent upon potassium concentrations within it. And we'll explore those when we get to that topic in A&P2. Calcium, of course, is an important mineral within our bones and teeth, so it's the mineral that gives our bones and teeth the strength that they have. We also see that calcium is also critically important for muscle contraction in a slightly different way than sodium and potassium are. Calcium is critical for muscle contraction, but it comes into play in a different way in muscle contraction. In later chapters, in chapter 9, we'll take a look at how the physiology of muscle contraction and how that works. And we'll see where calcium comes into play at that point. It's also important for conducting nerve impulses, and it's also important in some blood clotting factors as well. Phosphorus is an important part of the minerals that are within our bones as well. So usually the minerals that are found within our bones and teeth exist as calcium phosphate minerals or salts, and so phosphorus is another element that gives our bones and teeth their strength. They're also present in nucleic acids, which we'll talk about at the end of this lecture segment here. And phosphorus is an important part of a molecule called ATP, which is the cellular energy for our bodies. And finally, we have iron. Iron is a metal that's a critical component of hemoglobin. So hemoglobin is a protein that's found in your blood, and its purpose there is to carry oxygen. And iron is also a critical part of some enzymes within our cells and tissues as well. Okay, so we've explored the elements. Now let's briefly take a look at molecules. Now, molecules are defined as two or more elements that are joined by a chemical bond. So earlier we had talked about water. Water is a molecule with two hydrogens and one oxygen that are joined by chemical bonds. Carbon dioxide is another important molecule that we'll talk about later in ANP2. It is one carbon and two oxygens that are joined by chemical bonds. We talked about glucose already, so glucose you're familiar with as a molecule as well. So let's look at, now that we know what molecules are, let's take a look at a couple of important classifications of molecules, and we'll see kind of where, what categories different molecules fall into and what their overall function is. So we'll look at four important kind of classifications of molecules, and we'll discuss their functions as we get to them. So again, here in no particular order, we'll take a look at water as a molecule. We'll take a look at proteins, carbohydrates, and lipids as classes or classifications of molecules. So let's start with water. Why is water so important, right? Water constitutes roughly 70% of the volume of our cells, and there's quite a bit of a range here. So some cells have as little as maybe 60% of their cell volume is occupied by water. Others have much more water, and that number can be as high as 80% of our cell volume. So roughly, at kind of, if we were to look at all of the cells in our body and get an idea of how much of that cell volume is taken up by water, roughly 70% of our cell volume is taken up by water. Now, why water is so important is water behaves as what we call a solvent, and this means that solvents dissolve chemical elements and molecules so that their chemical bonds can be broken, and this allows new chemical bonds and new chemical bonds to be formed so that new or different molecules can be made within our body. So that is, when chemicals or molecules are dissolved in water, because water is a solvent, those chemical bonds are broken. And once those chemical bonds are broken, this allows our body to make new chemical bonds, and that allows us to form new molecules or different molecules. So therefore, water provides is the fluid medium in which the chemical reactions of life take place. So if we didn't have water in our bodies, the chemical reactions that sustain life would not be able to occur, or they would be able to occur, but it would be much more difficult for them to occur. And so we really need water to act as this fluid medium so that these chemical reactions can take place. So that's why water is so important to us and to our bodies, and really to life as a whole. So let's take a look at proteins now that we've explored water. So proteins don't take up quite as much of the in this case, the mass of our cell. So proteins comprise roughly 20% of our cell mass. And proteins are constructed from smaller subunits that are called amino acids. So in much the same way that a brick building is constructed of little bricks, you can think of the protein as the brick building and the amino acids as the bricks, the individual components that make up that brick building. There are 20 common amino acids that make up pretty much most, if not all, of the proteins in your body. There are 20 common amino acids that make or construct those proteins. And these amino acids can be configured in many different ways. So even proteins with the same types of amino acids, those amino acids can be chained together in different ways, which gives different properties to that protein. So proteins are made out of amino acid chains. Now, these amino acids are joined by what are called peptide bonds in order to form chains. And it turns out that the length of this chain determines the designation of the name that we give that structure. So when we chain amino acids together in peptide bonds, usually small chains of amino acids, anywhere from 2 to 9 amino acids long, is usually referred to as a peptide. So you can kind of think of this as a very small protein, right? But we usually refer to those in biology as peptides. So if you hear this term peptide, in your mind, I just want you to picture a small protein, because that's really what it is. It's just a small chain of amino acids here. Polypeptides are amino acid chains anywhere from 10 to about 49 amino acids in length. So you kind of think of these as like maybe a medium-sized protein here. And then the term that we actually give proteins, or the structure that we actually give the term protein to, is any amino acid chain that's greater than 50 amino acids long. 50 amino acids would actually be a pretty small protein, as proteins usually contain hundreds, if not thousands, of amino acids. So usually proteins are very large chains of amino acids. So there you have it. So you have different designations for different lengths of amino acid chains here. We have peptides, which are anywhere from 2 to 9 amino acids, polypeptides, which are 10 to 49 amino acids long, and proteins, which is anything greater than 50 amino acids. Now, peptides, polypeptides, and proteins are extremely diverse in their function in the body. So proteins as a whole have a very diverse set of functions within the body. I've pulled this table from chapter 2 because I think it's a nice summary of the functions of proteins within the body. So we see in this table they've kind of highlighted 6 major functions of proteins. We have structural support here in the upper left, enzymes. Proteins tend to function as enzymes, and we'll discuss that in a few minutes here. Some proteins function in transporting substances through the body. Some proteins function in contraction, particularly with muscles, and this generates pulling forces. Some proteins act in communication and defense as well. So let's start here. Let's take a look at the structural proteins. Now, some proteins are fibers or rope-like in their shape, and these proteins tend to function in mechanical support much like a rope. The example that they give here is collagen. Now, collagen is the single most abundant protein that's within your body, and collagen helps give tensile strength to bones, tendons, and ligaments. Now, what tensile strength means is that this protein is really strong under tension or pulling forces. So collagen is essentially a really great biological rope. So that is, you can pull on it and it will do a really great job of resisting those pulling forces. So really, collagen helps resist tearing in our body. So we see that some proteins are fiber-like or rope-like, and they function in providing mechanical support and structure. Many proteins in the body function as enzymes. Now, enzymes are biological catalysts, and what this means is that enzymes help to increase the rate at which substances are made or broken down by the body. That is, enzymes make it easier for a particular chemical reaction to occur. They give a couple of example enzyme names here, which I really won't emphasize to this point, so you don't have to commit these names to memory. But what I do want to highlight here while I'm here is that enzymes usually end in the suffix ase or ace. So if you see ace at the end of something, ase, then that's a really good indicator that molecule is an enzyme. And so we see here that this enzyme in this example is breaking down this disaccharide, which is just 2 sugar molecules that are linked together, into 2 monosaccharides or 2 single sugars. So we see that some proteins function as enzymes in catalyzing reactions. Other proteins function in transport, that is, moving substances through the body. For example, here they give the example of hemoglobin, which is a protein that's in your red blood cells, and it helps carry oxygen, so that way that oxygen can be delivered to the tissues that need it. We also see that some proteins behave as water-filled channels or tunnels across the plasma membrane of our cells. So really what your cell is that there's a fluid environment inside the cell, there's a plasma membrane, and that plasma membrane separates the fluid environment inside the cell from the fluid environment outside the cell. And some substances are not able to cross this plasma membrane unless there is a protein channel that allows that substance to move across the cell membrane here. So some proteins function as small tunnels or doorways through our plasma membranes so that substances can cross the cell membrane and enter the cell or exit the cell. Some proteins, particularly in muscles, we see that certain proteins like actin and myosin function in contraction, where we see the muscle shortening and generating a pulling force. So muscles can pull things like bones, particularly skeletal muscles generate pulling forces to move bones. And we'll see how these proteins, actin and myosin, work together in later chapters to generate those pulling forces that we see in muscles. We'll particularly focus on skeletal muscles, so we'll look at how the skeleton is moved by skeletal muscles. But smooth muscle and cardiac muscle behave in a very similar way to create pulling forces and move different substances throughout the body. We also see that some proteins function in communication between cells or transmitting signals between cells. Some can act as chemical messengers. That is, some proteins are amino acid based, which means that they are protein hormones. And hormones, their function is that they are released by endocrine glands into the blood, and the blood carries them throughout the body. And these hormones will then influence the activity of other body cells or tissues. And so in that way, proteins can act as chemical messengers, or they can also act as receptors in the plasma membrane. And so to give you a better example of that here, I'll show you this illustration here, in that some communication proteins act in what are called second messenger systems, where a chemical messenger like a hormone which is usually called the first messenger, so that can be a hormone or other chemical messenger, will bind to a protein receptor that's on the plasma membrane of the surface of our cell. And that protein receptor will then go on to activate a series of other proteins or enzymes within the cell, and these enzymes end up creating second messengers within the cell. And then it's these second messengers that alter the activity of the cell, or they dictate the cellular response. And so this first messenger essentially set off this chain reaction, this kind of domino effect of protein activation and enzyme activation. This is an enzyme here, right? Remember, we see the suffix ase here, adenylyl cyclase. So this is an enzyme that makes a second messenger inside of our cell. And this second messenger then ends up altering the activity or response of the cell that's been activated by this first messenger. And finally, we see proteins acting in defense or immune system functions. So antibodies are proteins that are released by specific types of immune cells, and these are proteins that bind to and inactivate foreign materials or pathogens within the body, like bacteria, viruses, or other toxic substances. So those are our proteins. So a very diverse function with the proteins. Let's go ahead and move on to the carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are approximately 2% of the cell mass. This is about 10 times less mass than we see of our typical proteins. So proteins constitute approximately 20% of our cell mass. Carbohydrates make up a significantly smaller proportion of our cell mass. Carbohydrates include things like starches, which are generally made by plants, and sugars as well. The main function of carbohydrates as a whole within the body is that carbohydrates function as chemical fuel. The main chemical fuel or main sugar fuel that's used by our body is glucose. So let's look a little bit more at carbohydrates. So carbohydrates are generally large structures that are built from chains of smaller sugars. And these smaller sugars are what we call monosaccharides. And so, in much the same way that amino acids build proteins, monosaccharides build carbohydrates, or monosaccharides are the small subunits of carbohydrates. So our carbohydrates are built from these small ring-shaped sugars that are called monosaccharides. And a couple of examples of those are glucose. Glucose is a monosaccharide. Fructose, which is fruit sugar, galactose, and ribose and deoxyribose, which are important in DNA and RNA, which we'll see in a few minutes here. So from these monosaccharides, we can build disaccharides. Disaccharides are two monosaccharides that are linked by a chemical bond. And so sucrose here, which is table sugar, is a glucose molecule that's chemically bound to a fructose molecule. So sucrose is a disaccharide composed of the monosaccharides called glucose and fructose. Maltose is simply two glucose molecules that are joined by a chemical bond, and lactose is a galactose and a glucose that are linked together. So we have monosaccharides and disaccharides. We also have polysaccharides. Now, polysaccharides are long chains of monosaccharides. Because they are long chains and they tend to be very branched in terms of their shape, that makes them relatively insoluble in water. That is, it's difficult for polysaccharides to be dissolved in water, which means that these are ideal molecules for storing sugars or storing monosaccharides. So starches, as I mentioned previously, are polysaccharides that are made by plants, and they have a very similar structure to this polysaccharide here, glycogen. Now, glycogen is a polysaccharide of glucose that's made by animals, and because of this, glycogen is usually referred to as animal starch, whereas starches are typically whereas other starches typically come from plants. But glycogen is an animal starch in that it is a polysaccharide of glucose. And so what our body does is it stores glycogen in places like our skeletal muscle and our liver. And our skeletal muscle and our liver uses enzymes to break down glycogen when we need glucose or when our body needs glucose. So that is when we start to break down glycogen, we release glucose from glycogen, and then that glucose can be used to make cellular energy. So that does it for the carbohydrates. Let's look briefly at the lipids here. Lipids come in a couple of different forms here. We'll discuss them as triglycerides, phospholipids, and steroids. Triglycerides that are solid are typically referred to as fats, and triglycerides that are liquid are typically called oils. We'll discuss triglycerides in the next couple of slides here, so we'll put those aside for now. Phospholipids are an important lipid that make up plasma membranes of our cells, and so they're important in maintaining boundaries for us. And steroids are another type of lipid that are important components of things like steroid hormones. So a couple of steroid hormones that we'll look at in this class and in A&P2 are hormones like testosterone, estrogen, cortisol, and aldosterone. And so all of these hormones are steroid based, and so they are formed from a steroid base. Also, things like vitamin D are steroid based, so steroids are an important component of certain vitamins like vitamin D. So let's take a look at, let's kind of go back to triglycerides and phospholipids, and we'll highlight some more of their functions here before we move on. So triglycerides get their name from the fact that they have a glycerol backbone and 3 fatty acid chains or tails that are attached to that glycerol backbone. Now, triglycerides function primarily as stored energy, so that is, they yield lots of energy when they are broken down or oxidized. So typically our body stores triglycerides in fat deposits or adipose tissue, and so our body can use these stored triglycerides in our adipose tissue to make energy when they are broken down. These stored fat deposits or adipose tissue can also help to protect and insulate deeper tissues and organs, since these are soft tissues, and so they do provide some protection and insulation as well. So to give you a couple of examples of where structures are protected, I should say, by adipose tissue, is we see in yellow here, these are large amounts of adipose tissue that surround the eyeball, which helps protect the eye within the skull, because the eye is pretty typically almost constantly moving within the skull. And so the movement of the eyeball within the skull causes the, or I guess I should say, just the fact that the eyeball is constantly moving within the skull, or typically moving quite a bit in the skull. This requires the eyeball to be protected so that it is not damaged from all of this movement, and so we see large adipose tissue deposits that surround the eye within the skull. We also see pretty thick layers of adipose tissue that surround organs like the kidney, so this helps to protect and cushion the kidney from any kind of damage. We also see large adipose tissue deposits in just underneath the skin in a region called the hypodermis, so this helps insulate our body against things like heat loss. And we also see adipose tissue deposits in the hollow cavities of things like our long bones. And so these are places in the body where triglycerides and adipose tissue can be stored in adipose tissue. Phospholipids are a lipid that is a principal component of the plasma membranes of our cells. These little yellow spheres with some like little tails that are coming off of it here are the phospholipids of our plasma membrane here. And cell membranes or plasma membranes are really critical to establishing boundaries between the inside of the cell and the outside of the cell, because a proper boundary means that the cell can conduct its biochemical reactions inside this very specialized environment within the cell. And so often the internal environment inside of the cell is different from the outside, the environment outside of the cell. And in order for those biochemical reactions inside of the cell to be to progress and work correctly, the cell needs to maintain a very specific set of internal conditions. And so the fact that the cell has a plasma membrane helps the cell separate the outside from the inside. Okay, so we've looked at carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and water. So let's finish up this lecture by discussing a couple of additional important molecules that I did not include in that list earlier. One of those important molecules or classes of molecules are the nucleic acids. And nucleic acids are things like DNA and RNA. And what the nucleic acids do is they help store, transmit, and express genetic information within our cells. So DNA is a kind of a ladder or a twisted ladder or helix-shaped structure that serves as the instructions for building all of the proteins within your body. So the reason why DNA is so important is because it's essentially the instruction manual for building the proteins within your body. RNA functions kind of as the intermediate between DNA and the protein synthesizing machinery in your cell. So DNA is typically locked within the nucleus of our cells, and so it's kind of trapped within there. And the machinery that makes protein is outside of the nucleus in the cell. And so because DNA is trapped, we need an intermediary molecule, and that's where RNA comes into play here. So RNA actually kind of acts as the messenger between DNA and the protein synthesizing machinery that's within our cells. So nucleic acids help to store and transmit to that genetic information so that proteins can be made correctly. And finally, we'll wrap up here with a molecule called adenosine triphosphate, or ATP. ATP functions as the energy currency of these cells of our body. So when we break down glucose and things like that, we release energy, and that energy is captured by making ATP. So essentially, the energy that's within the chemical bonds of glucose is released when glucose is broken down, and that energy that's released is captured and stored by ATP. So essentially, ATP, which has the general structure of a ribose sugar, an adenine, which is a nucleotide, or part of a nucleic acid, and these three phosphate groups here, we see that the ATP stores energy in these phosphate bonds here. So when our body needs that chemical energy, it breaks some of these it breaks some of these bonds that hold the phosphate groups together and releases that energy for when our body needs it.